All right, Shabbosai, good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Stephen Terry Zinn, for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month in honor of their newest grandson, Matan Shmuel Aaron. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, ultimately this young man will grow to be an incredible Ben Torah, and in merit Hashem a source of nachas for his family, Ad Mea Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Chof Zayin 27. We have this Chos Meretz Hashem to be able to go ahead and finish the parak today as well. So we are starting off on daf Chof Vav Amud Beis 26b. And we left off, I left you on a cliffhanger yesterday of Ein Znus Bebehema. Right, so again, we're trying to figure out a case in which if he delivered a kinui, right, he delivered a warning regarding a particular person, so it would be ineffective. So the Gemara was trying to go through an entire list. So I'm going to pop up. Let's just pick up with this. I'm going to pop up. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 21 lines up from the bottom. Papa says this comes to exclude a behema, that if he was mekaner, if he warned her ultimately again about a behema, ultimately again it would not be an effective kinui. Why? Because in znus behema, there is no concept of znus ultimately by an animal. I will say, so again, as we pointed out, there's bestiality by an animal, but there's not znus by an animal. Ultimately, again, from where is the following idea that the Rabbanan say, Eiznus bebehema, dichsiv lo savi esnon zona umechir kelef. Pasuk says, well, this is very, very interesting. They're talking about the prohibition for karbanos to bring in esnon zona. So we'll say esnon zona is if, let's say, a person went to a zone and he gave her a sheep. He gave her a sheep for services, right? That's called an esnon zona. That cannot be brought as a carbon. And mechir kelev. Mechir kelev is if you exchanged a dog for a sheep. So again, that exchanged sheep, so to speak, that exchanged sheep could not be brought as a carbon. Since in Vitanya we learned esnon kelev or mechir zona. So this is an interesting case. Esnan Kelev is if ultimately Rashi says Shim Adam Omer Lazona Helech Tala Vibaili Lekalbi. If a man says to a zona, take this sheep, and have znus with my dog, then ultimately again Mechir Zona ultimately Rashi says over here Haiselo Shifcha Zona Vechlifa Betala. If a person had a shifcha was a zona and ultimately exchanged that shifcha for a sheep, those interestingly enough would not be prohibited. So we'll say, so the reverse cases would not be prohibited. So the Gemara says, Shnei Emar, Gam Shnehem, because the Pasuk says these two items, Shnayim velo arba'a. It means two and not four. So the prohibition ultimately, again, only applies to Esnan Zona and Mechir Kelev. Now we'll say, what do you see from that? You see from that over here that interestingly enough, if a man were to go ahead and give the zona, right, go ahead and take this sheep, right, to have znus with this dog, ultimately the sheep would be permitted as a carbon. Interestingly enough, which shows you that ultimately, again, the bia with the behema does not constitute an act of znus. That was just a long proof to say that bia with a behema does not constitute an act of znus. So the Gemara says, Ve'elo shechva zer lamali. So I will say, so what does the phrase shechva zer in the case of Sotah, what does it come to teach me? So mi boy le'lechidisanya, shechvas zera, prat lidavar acher. Ultimately, I'm going to say, so shechva zera comes to exclude something else. My davar acher, Rav Sheshes prat l'shekina la shelo kidarka. We'll say, interesting case. What happens if halacha l'maisa, a husband specifically warned his wife regarding bia shelo kidarka? He went ahead, and this was the warning, right? Don't be alone with Shimon, in order that she not come to be a shelo kidarka. Obviously, a very specific type of kinui. Formally, Rava, I don't understand why should that be a problem. In other words, why should that be an ineffective kinui? Shelo kidarka mishkavei isha ksiv. The Torah outlines that there are two types of bia, and both halachically again are looked at as legitimate forms of bia kidarka, bia shelo kidarka. So ultimately, again, why would that not be a proper kinui? To which the Gemara says, Ela Amarava Prat L'Shekinala Derech Ivarim. So Rabbi say, interesting case. What happens if he delivered the warning, but ultimately, again, not for bia, but for touching? Just for touching. In other words, he went. That's lashon of derech ivarim. He went ahead and he gave the kinu. Again, I'm not worried that there's going to be bia. Reuben says, I'm not worried there's going to be bia. But ultimately, again, I prohibit you from being alone from Shimon unless you come to touching. Amrli Abaye pritzusa ba'almihi. So Rabbi say, again, as wrong as touching may be, but lamaisa, that's not an act of znus. That's an act of pritzos. It's actually interesting from a halachic perspective to distinguish between the concept of znus and the concept of pritzos, right? Ultimately, again, znus is a punishable offense. Pritzos, it's interesting because in English, we often translate them both as immorality, right? But in fact, znus ultimately, again, is a punishable, actionable behavior versus pritzos, which would be considered to be more in the realm of inappropriate conduct. Did the Torah prohibit pritzos? In other words, we'll say the answer to that is yes. But of course, what the Gemara is asking is from a legal perspective, did the Torah prohibit pritzos? El Amra Abaye Prat L'Shekinala B'Neshika. Ultimately, this is actually very interesting. So again, getting incredibly specific over here. So Rashi says over here, B'Neshika, Mashik Hashamish Ba'osam Makom. What happens ultimately, again, if the husband specifically delivers a kinoi? Again, I will say, these are a bit exaggerated cases, but Lamaisa there to make a particular point. What happens if halacha Lamaisa, the husband went ahead and delivered a kinoi for what we call neshika? Literally, again, he explicitly says that I prohibit you to be alone with Shimon, lest there be contact between the makom milah and the makom erva. Again, lav dafkan act of bia, right? But Lamaisa, again, contact, touching of those two makomos. So the Gemara says, Hani chalaman damar ha'ara zuhach nasa ateres. Atara, aval neshika v'lo klum. So we'll say that makes sense according to the opinion that says that bia, by definition, is penetration. But lamaisa, again, the shika, which just means, again, a touching of the makom mila and the makom erva, does not constitute an act of bia. So therefore, the pasuk is coming to say that if he warned her regarding the shika, ultimately, again, it's not a problem, right? Because lamaisa, that would not constitute an act of bia. But according to the opinion that says that initial bia is considered, or I should say neshika, right? Even the touching of the makom mila to the makom erva, ultimately, again, would constitute an act of bia. So what is there to say? In other words, that should definitely be a proper kinui. To which the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, you're right. Again, what are we talking about over here? Where ultimately, again, he went ahead and he delivered a kinui for what we call derech evarim. So Rabbi say derech evarim ultimately means, that he went ahead and delivered the kinui ultimately, again, for touching. So that's what he says. He says, Reuben strachel, don't be alone with Shimon, as I don't want any touching. So the Gemara says, so again, remember, we said before that Allah Lamaisa, that is not going to constitute a proper kinui. Why? Because ultimately, again, that will be pritzos, that will not be znus. And therefore, again, in order for a kinui to be proper, it has to be about znus. To which the Gemara says, what would you have thought? We'll say, I would have thought that, remember again, what is the whole essence of kinui? The whole essence of kinui is that the husband is bothered by something in his wife's behavior. So maybe he has the right to frame the kinui as he sees fit. And if he's bothered by this pritzos, maybe that has the ability to go ahead and affect a proper kinui. To which the Gemara says, "Ubal ha kapid kamashmala no." Kamashmala said that Allah said that's not the case, and that a kinui, as much as a kinui, of course, is at the discretion of the husband, but lamaisa at the end of the day, it has to be regarding a halachic act of znus, something that is not halachically actionable, right? As much as it may be inappropriate, Lamaisa again cannot generate the kinui. So that's the conclusion of the Gemara. In order for there to be a kinui, there has to be something actionable. Something actionable is defined as a halachically recognized act of znus, but something ultimately, again, that's what we call pritzusa ba'alma, inappropriate, but not legally actionable. Ultimately, again, that cannot generate a kinui. Fascinating. All right, so we'll say it's a little bit of a detour over here. Amar Shmuel. So we'll say really interesting Gemara now. Yisa Adam Duma, top of Chav Zayin. Yisa Adam Duma, Va'al Yisa Bas Duma. It is better for a person to marry a woman who is a Duma than to marry the daughter of a Duma. And I will say, what's a Duma? Look at Rashi, Tab Rashi Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Nit enes v'nedaberes befi kol al ni'ufeh. We'll say, Duma is a woman who is known to be immoral. Known to be immoral. Now, again, I will say, how is she known to be immoral? We're not talking about a situation where, again, there's hasra and edim, because, again, once again, that becomes then an actionable offense. But rather, again, everyone speaks about her immorality. So I will say, there's a concept in halacha of a kol. A kol means a rumor. So there are different types of rumors. There are rumors that are just that, rumors. And there are rumors that are so widespread and so embedded that the halacha assumes they have some degree of legitimacy. So therefore, the Gemara says over here, better to marry a Duma. So a Duma, again, is a woman who everyone speaks about her immorality, than to marry a Bas Duma, the daughter of a Duma. Why? So we'll say this is fascinating. So heard Shmuel says, Shazu ba mitipa kshera, v'zu ba mitipa psula. Because ultimately, again, the Duma, as inappropriate as her behavior may be, but Lamaisa, she comes, her genealogy is intact, right? In other words, the Duma herself is genealogically fit. Her behavior is inappropriate, but her genealogy ultimately is intact. As opposed to the Bas Duma, right? What's the challenge with the Bas Duma? If her mother is known to be so immoral, so her paternity is in question, and therefore her genealogy is questionable as well. So therefore Shmuel says, fascinating in hers, okay, obviously we're talking about someone with a very limited shidduch pool over here, right? So Lamais, again, if there's a choice between the Duma or the daughter of the Duma, go for the Duma. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Rabbi Yochanan says incredible. Yisa Adam Bas Duma Va'al Yisa Duma. Rabbi Yochanan says not true. Better to go ahead and marry the daughter of the Duma and not the Duma herself. Why? Rabbi said this is incredible. Shazu omedes becheskes kashrus, v'zu eina omedes becheskes kashrus. So Rabbi Yochanan says, one second, it's not simply about genealogical fitness, but rather what is it about? The nature and the quality and the character of the person, right? So remember again, the Bas Duma, the daughter of the Duma, what did she do? In other words, you don't choose your parents, right? So Lamaisa, again, she was born to. But as far as we know, she herself has a complete and absolute personal cheskas kashrus. That's fundamentally different, ultimately, again, than the Duma herself, who doesn't have a cheskas kashrus. So we'll say, so why this? Let's analyze this. So ultimately, again, why does the Bas Duma have the cheskes kashrus? So we'll see in just a moment. Well, actually, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shazu habas omedes becheskes kashrus umuteres labayla ulatipa psula lo chashin derov bi'ilos achar habal. So we'll say, Rabbi Yochanan is also bringing something else up over here, which is Rov bi'ilos achar habal, which means that the majority of active relations happen with the husband. That this is a general concept in halacha, that even if a woman is immoral, right, we still assume that any pregnancies ultimately, again, will come from the husband, because halacha lamaisa, rov bi'ilos achar habal, right? Ultimately, again, we assume that she's still with her husband more than she's with any other man. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, the Bas Duma has the cheskes kashrus, the mother does not. So let's analyze. Interesting machlokes. So Meisvei, Gemara brings back, says, no se Adam Duma, right? A man should marry a Duma. And I will say, here's what's interesting. No se Adam Duma sounds like a lachatchila. So I will say, so Gemara raises as a kasha. This clearly supports Shmuel, and is a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, to which the Gemara says, Amar Rabba v'tizbara, no se lachatchila. This whole brayse obviously is flawed, because they will say, no say sounds like lachatchila. So lachatchila is someone suggesting that a man should marry a Duma, to which the Gemara says, Ella imnasa. Rather, it means if you married, such a marriage is legitimate. So once you're changing it to imnasa, change it to what? bas duma as well. If you're already going to make change to the brisa, so make more comprehensive changes to the brisa. So we'll say, fundamental machlokes. If this is what I'm limited to it in the shidduch pool, between a duma and a bas duma, an immoral woman and the daughter of an immoral woman, who should one marry? Shmuel is saying better to marry the duma, because Lamaisi, you know that she's genealogically fit. The bas duma, you really don't know about her genealogy. Rabbi Yochanan is saying no, better to marry the bas duma, because she has a cheskas kashrus, and the mother doesn't have a cheskas kashrus. For hilchasa, so I will say, what is the halacha? Always hilchasa, yisa adam bas duma va'al yisa duma. I will say the halacha is better to marry the bas duma than the daughter herself. Why? The Tanur of Tachlifa Ba'marava coming to Rabbi Avo, Isha mizana, even if a woman is immoral, banea ksherin. Ultimately, again, her children are kosher. Her children are kosher. Why? Rov bi'ilos achar habal. Because ultimately, you know, say halacha operates with this principle of rov bi'ilos achar habal. That even if she is immoral, we assume that the majority of times that she engages in relations, it is with her husband, and therefore halacha lemaisa, her children have a cheskas kashrus. So we'll say, so that is the halacha lemaisa here. Fascinating. By Rav Amram. So Rav Amram says, what about haisa prutza bi'oser mahu? We'll say, what happens if she wasn't just immoral, but she was abundantly immoral? In other words, we'll say, the concept of rov bi'ilos achar habal says that there is still a rov, right? That's what that operates with. So rov is a halachic concept, right? And rov tells you that there is a halachic majority. The halachic majority makes it as if the minority doesn't exist. It's actually a fundamental machlokes in rov in general, how rov works. Does rov negate the identity of the minority, or does rov acknowledge the minority, but ultimately tell you that the majority still is the statistical probability? I'll give you a simple example. If you have two kosher pieces of meat mixed together with one non-kosher piece of meat, so I will say, can you eat all three pieces of meat? Right? So again, if you say rov eclipses the minority, then you should say it makes it as if the minority doesn't exist, you can eat all three. Or you say no. Rov says that when you pick up a piece of meat, what do we say? The statistical probabilities that you're picking up a kosher piece of meat. And you could say that ultimately until you get to the last piece of meat, but pashtus, you wouldn't then eat the last piece. We actually saw this in Chulin, in our last cycle. We'll get to it again in Meretz Hashem. In any event, the point over here is, Rov bi'ilos achar habal says that there is a statistical probability that when she becomes pregnant, it's her husband's child. The Gemara is asking, what happens if that rov doesn't exist? That's the shaila. What happens if the rov doesn't exist? Why wouldn't the rov exist? Because unfortunately, she is ridiculously promiscuous. What would happen in that situation? So this is actually very interesting. So was a little bit tie into our smichas chaver, which an incredibly ashkach to all those who took it. Baruch Hashem, with over 30 guys in the Mishnah ended up taking it, and Baruch Hashem, everyone's doing great so far. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, so according to the opinion that says that a woman normally becomes pregnant right before she becomes a nida, so lemais again, then loti by the it's not a kasha. Why? The lo yadaba, because the husband doesn't necessarily know when his wife is going to become a nida, and therefore lo mintarla, he can't keep an extra watchful eye on her. Kiti bailacha. So where does so in other words, if a man knows, well, let's finish up. Kiti bailacha. Where does the kasha come up? Haliba demand damar in isha misaveres el samach l'tvilasa. That a woman normally becomes pregnant right before she goes to the mikvah. Mai kevan diyada banaturi mintarla. Since he knows when she's going to the mikvah, ultimately keep an extra watchful eye on her. Oh, dilma kevan de prutza biyoserlo. Or no, maybe once someone is incredibly promiscuous, there's no way to keep an eye on them. So we'll say, what the Gemara is pointing out over here is as follows. The idea would be that even if Rahman al-Islam, a husband knows that his wife is not behaving appropriately, he may try to keep just an extra watchful eye on her at a time that he knows she can become pregnant, in order not to compromise the integrity of the family. So there's a machlokes in halacha in terms of generally when is a woman most fertile. Is it right before she becomes a nida, or right before she goes to the mikvah? So if it's right before she becomes a nida, the husband doesn't always know when his wife is going to become a nida, and therefore he can't necessarily exert an extra watchful eye over her. On the other side, on the other hand, if it's before she goes to the mikvah, a husband knows when his wife is going to the mikvah, and therefore he could exert an extra watchful eye over her, which would then mean that even in the event that she is incredibly promiscuous, he may be able to safeguard the genealogical integrity of the family. Therefore, the Gemara says, teku. The Gemara kind of leaves it open. So therefore, I will say, for our purposes over here, if there's a choice between a duma and a bas duma, this is important halacha. So the Gemara says, marry the bas duma. Marry the bas duma. Why? Because the bas duma herself, personally, right, has a chezkas kashrus, right? She herself could be a pious and good individual, irrespective of the family she was born into. What about her genealogical fitness? So remember again, her genealogical fitness is cared for. What is the genealogical fitness covered by? Rov bi'ilos achar habal. Right? We assume that the majority of acts of abiyah still occur with the husband. So what happens with a woman who ultimately, again, is incredibly immoral and promiscuous, to the point that maybe you don't have the rov? So that the Gemara leaves open-ended. And enachinami, again, that would be a kasha. Fine. Ve'elu shebezdin. Suppose this, remember again, the Mishnah then went through a series of cases, ultimately again, where Beis Din administers the kinui, administers the warning on behalf of the husband. So the Gemara says, ish. Pasuk says ish. Ma'atam ish. So we'll say, why does the Pasuk say, Ma'atam ish? Ish l'rabos, ish es cherish, ve'ish es Sotah, ve'ish es shiamum, v'shahalach baila l'medinas hayam, v'shahaya chavush ve'is hasurim. So we'll say, ish comes to include the following cases. The wife of a cherish, remember again, a cherish is deaf mute, right? The wife ultimately again of a Sotah, someone who is deranged or insane. Ve'ish es shamum. So we'll say, Sotah and shamum are just different levels of mental instability. But the common denominator is, both of them lack capacity. So the Gemara says, excuse me, a husband is overseas, or the husband was incarcerated. So I'll say all of these are cases where the husband is not currently accessible, either not cognitively accessible or not geographically accessible. So what's the case? The case is where Beis Din sees that the wife is acting inappropriately. So what does Beis Din do? She Beis Din mekanen lahen leposlan miksuvasan. Beis Din could administer a warning to these women, right? Ultimately, now what does the warning do? So remember again, the warning can't cause them to drink, because drinking ultimately again can only be brought about by the husband himself. So what can the warning do? So Beis Din mekanen lahen leposlan miksuvasan. What the warning can do ultimately again is cause them to lose out on their ksuva. You might have thought, so we'll say, so just to play that out, what that would mean is, if Beis Din administers a warning, and then the woman is in violation of that warning, ultimately, again, that could cause her to lose her ksuva, cause her to forfeit her ksuva. So the Gemara says, you might have thought maybe such a warning could cause her to drink as well. Tamalomar, vehevi ha'ish es ishto. The pasuk says, the man will go ahead and bring his wife, which indicates to us what? That halacha l'maisa, I'm sorry, that it is only the husband who has the ability to bring his wife to drink. Rabbi Yossi says, aflash kosa. Rabbi Yossi says, ultimately again, Beis Din could even cause her to drink. And ultimately, you know, say, so ultimately again, but when does the drinking occur? The drinking occurs ultimately when the husband becomes either of capacity or ultimately becomes geographically or cognitively accessible. So I will say, so a fundamental machlokes, everyone is agreeing that Beis Din has the ability to administer a warning. Right? The shaila is, what can that warning do? So first opinion says the only thing that warning could do is cause her to forfeit her ksuva in the event that she violates the warning. Second opinion says, no, it could even cause her to drink. Now, cause her to drink when the husband becomes accessible to take her to the basement. So both say, no, everyone agrees that Beis Din can never bring a woman to drink. Right, that can't happen. But the shaila is, could a warning that Beis Din gives essentially, so let's say the husband's a Sotah, and Baruch Hashem he's healed, or he's overseas and he comes back. So now a warning has been given, a warning has been violated. Could a husband go ahead and take his wife to the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately to go ahead and cause her to drink based on this warning. So this is the machlokes. So b'maika miflagi. So Rabbi say, what's the machlokes? What's the machlokes? So here we go. So the Gemara says, Rabbanan savri ba'inon vikine vehevi. So Rabbi say, the Rabbanan say you require vikine vehevi, which literally means he warned and he brought. Take a look at Rashi. I will say Rashi is 2, 4, say about 8 lines up from the bottom. Vikine vehevi hamakana law yashkena. So I will say, according to the Rabbanan, you need the same person, so to speak, to administer both parts of this process. You need the same person to administer vikina and the same person to administer vehevi. So in other words, if the husband administers the warning, then the husband could bring her to drink. But if the husband doesn't administer the warning, i.e. Beis Din does it, then the husband cannot bring her to drink. That's the position of the Rabbanon. Rabbi Yossi Savar, Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't need it. You don't need it. In other words, there are two distinct parts of the process. And even if Beis Din does the first part of the process of the kinui, the husband could do the second part of the process of bringing her to drink. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. So Tan Rabbanon, let's analyze. So we learned Tan Rabbanon, Asher Tishte, Asher Tiste Isha Tachas Isha V'nitma. So the Gemara says, Lahakish Ish liisha, v'isha liish. So Rabbi say this comes to compare the woman to the man, or I should say the man to the woman, and the woman to the man. So Rabbi say, so Lamai Hilchas. Rabbi say, so again, it's correct. Asher tista isha tachas isha. So to remember again, the first isha is referring to the wife. The second isha is ish shelo, her husband. So it's comparing the wife to the husband. So how do you compare the wife to the husband? What does this mean? So Lamai Hilchos. So Amrav Sheshes Kishem Shemhu Suma Lo Haya Mashke. So let's listen to this to teach us the following. If the husband, some fascinating halachos over here. If the husband was blind, he would not be eligible to administer the Sotah waters to her. Why not? T'chsiv v'ne'elam me'ene isha. Because the pasuk by Sotah says she engaged in behavior which was hidden from the eyes of her husband. Hidden from the eyes of her husband. Kach im hi haisa suma lo haisa shosa. So too ultimately again, if she was blind, ultimately she wouldn't drink as well. So Rabbi say, so again, the same way that if he was blind, based on the pasuk, v'ne'ela me'ene isha, and what's the whole process of Sotah? She's doing something that he can't see. Well, if he is unable to physically see, then he's not subject to the Sotah process, or he's ineligible, so to speak, to engage in the Sotah process. So too, if she can't see, because remember again, what the Gemara is saying over here is, whatever applies to him applies to her. Whatever applies to her applies to him. So Allah say again, if he's blind, it makes him ineligible for the Sotah process. If she's blind, she's ineligible for the Sotah process. Rav Ashi says, Kishem, shechigeres v'gidemes lo haisa shosa. The same Rabbi say that ultimately, and chigeres means she doesn't have feet, or doesn't have legs. Right? Gidemes means she doesn't have hands. So if she doesn't have feet, or she doesn't have hands, she is ineligible for the Sotah process. Why? Dichsev, Rabbi say, Amad Beis, Dichsev, v'hemid hakoin es ha'isha lifnei Hashem, v'nosan al kapel. Because Rabbi say, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says the Kohen shall stand the woman before Hashem, and ultimately put the carbon on her hands, her mincha on her hands. So I will say, that pasuk tells you that the woman has to be able to do two things. Number one, stand. Number two, hold something in her hands. So if she doesn't have feet, or she doesn't have legs, and therefore cannot stand, or she doesn't have hands, and therefore can't hold something in her hands, Lamaisa, she is ineligible for the Sotah process. Kach hu im hayechiger ogidem lo hayamashke. So we'll say, remember again, it's the reciprocal idea. Whatever applies to her applies to him. Whatever applies to him applies to her. So too, if he was missing feet or hands, he would also be ineligible for the Sotah process. Rabbi Rashi says, Kishem she'ilemes lo haisa shosa d'chsiv v'amra isha amen amen. Well, the same way that if she was unable to speak, if she was mute, she would be ineligible for the Sotah process. Why? Because they all say part of the Sotah process requires her to what? Answer amen, or amen amen. So being unable to answer amen amen precludes her from participating in the process. Kachu im haya ilem lo haya mashke. So to the husband, if he was mute, he would also be unable to go ahead and participate in the process as well. Fine. So I will say so. That's just this last reciprocal, which is quite interesting. So what about the previous question? What about the question about the kinui of Beis Din? So I'll say, so Rambam paskins that Beis Din does have the ability to deliver a kinui on behalf of the husband. They do have, in other words, if they see the wife acting inappropriately, they do have the ability to offer up the warning. But lamaisa, the warning only works to preclude her from collecting ksuva. Ultimately, again, will not work to ultimately cause her to drink. We do subscribe to the drasha, to the Rabbanan's drasha of the kinei, the hevi. Only one who goes ahead, only if the husband delivers the warning, does he have the ability to go ahead and take her to drink. But Lamais, if he didn't deliver the warning, then again, so in a case where let's say he's incarcerated, Beis Din delivers the warning, he gets out, the most that violation of the warning could do was to cause her to forfeit her ksuva. But Allah Lamaisa cannot go ahead and trigger the obligation to drink. Incredible. I will say, Hadran Allah, Arusa, Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. I will say, brand new parak. Some very interesting ideas over here. I will say, so actually, it's actually a wonderful thing. Prakim don't necessarily have to be related, but there happens to be an excellent segue over here, because Lamaisa, you can remember, what was the piece we just ended off with? A certain degree of reciprocity in the Sotah process. So I will say, continuing in that same theme of reciprocity, so the Mishnah says, Kishem shamayim bodkin osa, kach hamayim bodkin oso. We've made reference to this a number of times already, but here it is explicitly. In the same way that the waters check her, the waters check him as well. Rabbi saying, now here's what's interesting. What's missing from the Mishnah? What's missing from the Mishnah? Who's the him? Who's the him? Remember again, there are two hymns in this Sotah narrative, right? What are the two hymns? Hymn number one ultimately again is the husband. Hymn number two is the adulterer. So we'll see an interesting discussion. Bepashtos, we assume, is talking about the adulterer, right? Because the adulterer is the one who went ahead and committed the crime. So if Lamaisa, again, the waters are going to check her, they should check the adulterer as well. Although maybe what the Mishnah is teaching us, or will say, is, listen, if a man is going to subject his wife to this process, right, to this level of moral scrutiny, so the husband better have his house in order also. As well say, whatever you're going to go ahead and demand of someone else, so Lamaisa, again, you have to be ready to go ahead and live up to that same level of expectation as well. So again, we'll discuss exactly who the who is in the Gemara. Fine. But nevertheless, Keshem Shamayim Bodkin Oso, Kach Hamayim Bodkin Osa, Shneemar, Ubou. We'll say ultimately again, Ubou. And we'll say now, Lashon over here, it says Ubou Hamayim. Bou, right? Bou is plural. Right? Ubou Hamayim. Literally again, it's two comings, right? Two comings. In other words, so Bou, it will come plural. Fine. So Keshem Sha'asur Labal, and I will say in the same way, if a Sotah is found guilty, so the same way she is asur, she's prohibited to her husband, she's also prohibited to the adulterer. Shene'emar v'nitma'a divrei Rabbi Akiva. Because I will say, the Torah uses the lashon of, it doesn't just say nitma'a, but rather it says v'nitma'a. So I will say, so remember again, the context of the pasuk is, Zos taras hakinos asher tiste isha tachas isha Nitma'a. So we'll say if a woman is indeed found to be a Sotah, not also so Nitma'a teaches me that she's prohibited to her husband. Vav, they will say that Vav is extra. So in general, whenever you see an extra Vav, that is always ripe for a drasha. And therefore, halacha l'maisa teaches me that she can go ahead and she becomes prohibited to the boel, to the adulterer as well. I'll say, Rabbi Akiva. I'll just point out something very, very beautiful. There is a piece. I saw a piece by Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev, Zechusa Yagin Aleinu. So the Rebbe says you learn a very important yisod from this opening phrase of the Mishnah of Kishem Shamayin Bodkin Osa, Kachamayin Bodkin Oso. What is in the same way that the water checks him, the water checks her. So get ready for this. So the Rebbe writes, he says, Tam, Masha Chasidim Shosin Mashke, Af Shalo Bifnei Achola, Utfilasam Ose Pri Tnuva. So I'll say, by the Chasidim, the Rebbe writes, it's a big thing to make a l'chaim. And I will say that by the Chasidim, so making a l'chaim is not just having a drink. I've mentioned this a number of times. Making a l'chaim is a bracha that you give to someone. right? Like l'chaim literally means, in other words, when you drink a l'chaim with another Jew, you're giving that person a bracha, right? You say l'chaim. Ultimately, again, you should have a good life. It's a bracha. So the Rebbe says, sometimes when you hear that someone is ill, you make a l'chaim to them. You make a l'chaim to them. Now, I understand why a bracha should work when you are in the presence of someone else, right? You give someone else a bracha. That's a direct dialogical connection. The bracha like that. But yet, the Rebbe says it works to make a l'chaim for another Jew, even not in their presence. Even not in their presence. So ultimately, again, from where do you see a concept that making a l'chaim for someone works even not in their presence? So the Rebbe says, "Dematzinu b'Torah eitzel Sotah v'hishke es hamayim kishem shamayim botkin es ha'isha kena mayim botkin es ha'ish." So the Rebbe says the source for this is Sotah. So we'll say what happens. The Isha Sotah drinks the water in the Beis Hamikdash. And what does the Mishnah say? What does the Mishnah say? The same way the water drinks her. The same way the water tests her. We'll go with the adulterer for now. The water tests him. The adulterer, wherever he is as well. So what do you see from here? An act of drinking by a Jew in one place has an impact on a Jew in a different place. And the Rebbe says, listen to this. So he says, right? You see from here that drinking something in one place has an effect on a Jew in another place. The adua, demida tova, meruba memidas paranius. And the Rebbe says, we know that the midah tova, right? The midah of good always outflanks, always outweighs the midah of negativity. The imkain, so the Rebbe is supposed to say, isn't this beautiful? So clearly, if the Sotah is going to work to make a Sotah l'chaim, right, essentially, right? If it's going to work for the Sotah to drink the water in the Beis Hamikdash, and it's going to check her adulterer wherever he is, then the Rebbe says the ability to make a l'chaim in someone's zuchos, even if they are not present, certainly helps as well. Let's say, is that not absolutely incredible? Right? So if anyone ever asks you, what's the makar that a l'chaim works for someone's benefit, even if they're not in geographic proximity? Mishnah, Maseches Sotah, Chav Zayin Amud Beis. If the Sotah l'chaim works to go ahead and judge the adulterer wherever he is, certainly a l'chaim for the benefit of another Jew absolutely works wherever he or she may be as well. Incredible. I'm Rabbi Yeshua. Shabbos says, remember again, back to Rabbi Akiva. Right? Rabbi Akiva's drasha ultimately again was vinitma, since it's written in longer form. So vinitma ultimately teaches me that she becomes asura, to the Baal and to the Boel in the event that she is guilty. On Rabbi Yeshua says, Kacha Yadorsh Zechariah ben Akatzav. Zechariah ben Akatzav ultimately went ahead and darshaned the same way. He said as follows, Rabbi Omer, Shnei Pama Amura beParsha, Nitma Vinitma, Echad Lebal ve'Echad Lebal. So I'll say all the Gemara is saying over, all the Mishnah is saying over here is that Halacha L'Maisa, before Rabbi Akiva, Zechariah ben Akatzav already made this same drasha. Good. So far, two halachas in our Mishnah. Halacha number one, let's go with the Pashut Pshat. The same way the water checks the Sotah, the water checks the man with whom she committed adultery. That's number one. Number two, Vinit Ma'at teaches me, Rabbi Akiva and Zechariah ben Akatzav, that halacha l'maisa again, that halacha l'maisa, she is asur to the Baal, to her husband, and to the Baal, to the adulterer. Incredible. Next, Bo Bayom. Let's give a little introduction over here. On that day. Now, what's that day? So as I take a look at Rashi, this is incredible. Bo Bayom Darash, B'Meseches Brachas. Rashi over here says this is referencing a very specific episode which we learned in Maseches Brachas. What did the Gemara say? Amirim dechol echad detani bo bayom hu yom show shivas Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lenasius shenisrabu talmidim shenasnu rishus likanis lakol shahaya Rabbi Gamliel Omer kol talmid chacham shein tocho kibaro al yikanis lebeis hamikdash. Rabbi said, listen to this. We are familiar with the story. We actually just referenced it at the Seder. At the Seder on Pesach, Shabbos, we're familiar with the story where Rabbi Gamliel was deposed, right? Rabbi Gamliel was removed from his position as the Nasi, and he was replaced with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Right, young Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah made a number of different changes that first day that he was in position. I was saying, it's interesting that in leadership in general, there's a fascinating like leadership machlokes. When you come into a new leadership position, how quickly should you implement change, right? In other words, is it good to make change immediately, or is there conventional wisdom like no, sit tight, like learn a little bit, understand a little bit, and then ultimately again make the change gradually and perhaps a little bit. So Elazar ben Azariah did both, but he felt that there were certain changes that needed to be implemented immediately. One of the first things he did was Rabbi Gamliel had stationed a guard by the door of the Beis Medrash. Right? Remember again, he had said, any Talmid Chacham shein tocho kibaro. In other words, only genuine Talmidei Chachamim. Literally, again, any Talmid Chacham whose inside is like his shetocho kibar, right? Whose inside is like his outside. In other words, genuine piety could come in. So we'll say, so obviously, there were not a lot of people in the Beis Medrash. The first thing Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah did is he removed the guard from the Beis Medrash, and again, they say that day they had to add in benches and benches in the Beis Medrash because there was such an influx of people that day. So Rashi says over here, "V'rab Torah bo bayom." So most listen to this. There was such a proliferation of Torah that first day because there was such a tidal wave of people coming into the Beis Medrash that first day. Supposed to listen to this. And there was such a surge of Torah that there was no question that remained unanswered that day. There is no question that remained unanswered that day. So I will say, is that not absolutely incredible? Absolutely incredible. So I'll say, so therefore the Gemara says, Rashi points out over here, whenever you see the phrase bo bayom on that day refers to this day. That day refers to the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took away the guard from the Beis HaMikdash and ultimately allowed everyone entry into the Mikdash. Into the Beis Medrash. So Boba of Rabbi Akiva. So what's Rabbi Akiva darshan that day? He said the ukli chares asher yipom el tocho kol asher b'socho yitma. So Rabbi say halachas of tum and tara. If you have a kli chares, right, an earthenware vessel, anything kol asher yipom el tocho, anything that falls into a kli chares yitma ultimately again becomes tamei. So the Gemara says, okay, so what says now, remember again, a kli cheres itself can become tamei through its airspace, right? Ultimately, so what is the Gemara talking about? So ino omer tamei, so we'll say, it doesn't say the kli cheres will become tamei, rather it says ella yitma. It says the kli cheres will what? Kli cheres will what? Convey tuma. So what's the case? L'tamei acherim, lamara kikar sheni shemetami es shlishi. Teaching us a very important halacha. We'll say, namely, that a kikar sheni ultimately again could go out and make a shlishi. Now we'll say, now what's the case over here? The case here we'll say is as follows. If you could imagine for a moment, if you have a kli cheres, and ultimately again something tamei falls into the kli cheres. Let's say, for example, for illustration purposes, because what the Mishnah is using, let's say we're talking about an earthenware oven. An earthenware oven. So imagine for a moment you have an earthenware oven. There is a loaf of bread. There is a loaf of bread baking inside that earthenware oven, right? So lemaisa again. So lemaisa. Now you have the loaf of bread. Something tamei now comes into that oven. So I will say, so what ends up happening? So the oven, right after it comes in contact with the tamei item, becomes ultimately again a rishon. The oven then goes ahead and makes the bread a sheni, and now the bread has the ability to convey tumah to something else and make it a shlishi. Progression of tumah, right? Tumah being the av, the source of tumah. Let's say a sheretz falls in. Sheretz falls onto the oven, makes the oven a rishon. Rishon conveys tumah to the bread. Bread is a sheni. Bread has the ability to convey a tumah to a third item called a shlishi. Okay. Fine. So we'll say again, obviously we'll expound that in the Gemara. I'm Rabbi Yeshua. Mi yigala afar meinecha Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yeshua when he heard this halacha, said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who will go ahead and clear the dust from your eyes? And I will say, now remember again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had already passed away. So this was saying, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, if you can only come back from the grave and see, this is a good thing, this is a good statement, and see what's happening now. Shayisa Omer, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to say, Asid dar acher letar kikar shlishi she'en lo mikra min haTorah. You said a future generation will come and say that a kikar shlishi, right, a loaf of bread that is a shlishi for tumah, ultimately is tahar. Why? She'en lo mikra min haTorah. Because they both say there doesn't seem to be any pasuk from the Torah which supports the concept of a shlishi. Valo Rabbi Akiva Talmidcha, maybe lo mikra min haTorah. But yet Rabbi Akiva, your Talmud, brings a scriptural proof that in fact the shlishi is Tamei Shene'emar Kol Asher B'Socho Yitma. Because Rabbi say again, he says anything that's in the oven, Yitma, will convey tumah to something else. Rabbi say, so again, this is talking about, you have to understand something. On that day, that Bo Bayom, there was such like a total revolution that occurred. So here's like another example of this. Rabbi Akiva is darshaning that the bread which is a sheni can make something a shlishi. Based on a pasuk. Rabbi Yoshua says, oh my gosh, Rabbi Yochanan Mezaka, if only you could be here to see this. Because you always said, at some point in time, someone's going to say a shlishi is tar. Why? Because there's no pasuk that teaches me about a shlishi. And now, Bo Bayom, on that very day, Rabbi Akiva, your student, comes and brings a pasuk to support the shlishi. I will say, really, really incredible idea. Bo Bayom, Darash Rabbi Akiva. On that day, Rabbi Akiva darshan. So I'll say all that same Bo Bayom. Umado semichutz la'ir as paas keidma apayim ba'ama. So I'll say, here the pasuk is talking about as follows. Pasuk is talking about over here this concept of leaving 2,000 amas outside of the city. Right, leaving out 2,000 amas outside of a city, leaving 2,000 amas. Umikra acher omer, mikira ir v'chutza elef ama. I have another pasuk that says, ultimately, how much do I have to leave? I have to go ahead. Say this is. I'm sorry. Let me clarify. Some by the Levitic cities. So one pasuk says you have to leave 2,000 amas open. Another pasuk says you leave 1,000 amas. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, "Ef shalom elef amas shekvar ne'amar apayim." You can't say you only have to leave 1,000 because it already says 2,000. V'ef shalom apayim shekvar ne'amar elef. You can't say 2,000 because it already says 1,000. So we'll say what's going on over here. One is, what do you do with the space outside of the Levitic cities? So the Gemara says, "Haketzad." So how do you reconcile this? Haketzad elef ama migrash. Va'apayim ama tchum hashabbos. So we'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, here's the distinction. It's 1,000 amas ultimately again is considered to be migrash. Migrash ultimately again is open area, and then 2,000 amas is tchum Shabbos. So we'll say, so the first answer is two separate halachas. First halacha is coming to teach me that the tchum Shabbos, we'll say the Shabbos boundary is 2,000 amas. We know this halacha, we saw this in Shabbos. That is the amount that you are permitted to travel from the edge of habitation. So let's say habitation ends at the edge of the city. You could travel 2,000 amas past the edge of the city. The second halacha teaches me, ultimately again, 1,000 amas should be left open area. Right? There's like a halacha of leaving park area, open area by the cities of the Levium. No. Elef ama migrash. In fact, Rabbi means something a little bit different. It means it should be 1,000 amma ultimately open space, and the other 1,000 ammas ultimately could be fields and vineyards. So we'll say on the outskirts of the Levitic cities, you're supposed to have 2,000 ammas of space that you're not building on. What do you do with the 2,000 ammas of space? 1,000 ammas is just left open area. Second 1,000 amas ultimately is, you can use it for whatever you want, but agricultural purposes, not building purposes. Incredible. Bo Bayom Dar Rabbi Akiva. I will say beautiful Gemara. On that day, that day, same idea. All of it's happening on that same day. Rabbi Akiva Darshan, he said as follows. Oz Yashir Moshe b'nei Yisrael Sashira Azos Lashem. So Vayomru. So we'll say the pasuk says, Oz Yashir, then Moshe and b'nei Yisrael will sing this song Vayomru. And they said, so we'll say, Lemar, so the Gemara says, Vayomru, Lemar, Shvayomru Lemar, Shein Tamalomar Lemar, Umat Tamalomar Lemar. So we'll say, it's repetitive. It should just say Vayomru. Why does it have to say Vayomru Lemar? Right? They said, saying. What's that second Lemar for? Melame Yisrael, listen to this. Shahayu Yisrael onin shira acharav shel Moshe. So I'll call Davar v'Davar kikorna sahalal. The Rabbi say it means that whatever Moshe Rabbeinu said, Klal Yisrael repeated, right? It was done. The shira was uttered in a repetitive fashion, the same way we recite Hallel. Lekach ne'emar lemar. So Moshe is actually interesting. So essentially the addition of the pasuk is, so it says, right, so Hashem vayomru lemar. The lemar ultimately means whatever Moshe Rabbeinu said, they repeated, just like the reading of Hallel. Rabbi Nechemia says, no. Kikorin es Shema, but look, Kikorin ba'asa Hallel. No, they didn't read it like Hallel, rather they read it like Shema. They will say, from the Mishnah, we don't know the difference. What does that mean? Like they said it like Hallel, they said it like Shema. So obviously we'll see ultimately again in the Gemara what it means. But I will say what we do emerge with is that last Lamar is teaching us about how Klal Yisrael ultimately went ahead and responded to the Shira of Moshe Rabbeinu. Incredible. We'll say, you know what we'll do? We'll stop over here for a day. We'll leave this last part of the Mishnah, Emir Hashem, for tomorrow. Actually, let's just read a little bit more. Bo Bayom, Darsh, Rabbi Yeshua ben. Actually, let's leave it. We'll stop over here. Stop over here. Again, we did good. I think it's a shorter daf tomorrow. Anyway, yeah, very short daf tomorrow. Amud Beis is very short. So let's stop over here. So just to share with you. Sorry. So we'll say just to share, a little bit in terms of Yom HaZikaron. So we know that today Yom HaZikaron, so Eretz Yisrael's Day of Remembrance is the day on which we remember the 24,213 men, women, and children actually who have died since 1860. Right, again in the initial struggles. Right, even before the establishment of the state, but for the struggles ultimately of establishing Jewish habitation in Eretz Yisrael. And I will say, I'll mention it more tomorrow again, but I just want to point out that no matter like how you feel about the Medina, right? I always think about this every year, that these days of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut often get shrouded in like a lot of hashkafic controversy, right? In other words, is the establishment of the state of Israel aschalta de geula, is the beginning of messianic process, is not the beginning of messianic process? To a certain degree, okay, that's a legitimate like theological debate. Just like, by the way, just like the opinions that say that the concept of a state doesn't have a place within. Again, these are all theological and religious and hashkafic debates which are legitimate and absolutely should be had. In other words, a person should always be secure enough in their particular beliefs that they could hear someone else espouse their beliefs. But one thing is clear. Whatever you think the role of the state is in the progression of Jewish destiny, we are privileged to live in a time where there is a Jewish homeland. And we are privileged to live in a time. I was supposed to go to Eretz Yisrael this week. Whatever. Unfortunately, I had to end up canceling my plans. But the notion that like I had a ticket that I could just cancel, that I could rebook, a minute later if I needed to, and be in my ancestral homeland within just a couple of hours. Is an incredible zechus, an overwhelming zechus that generations before us did not have. And at Yom HaZikaron, what we recognize is that zechus and that privilege comes with a very, very steep price. Very steep price. Literally, just yesterday afternoon, as the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael were getting ready to go ahead and begin Yom HaZikaron remembrances, there was a terror attack right outside of Machane Yehuda. And I will say, if you saw the pictures, you will definitely recognize that spot, right? That intersection is right behind Lev Yerushalayim, right by there's the bakery, I think it's Nechama Bakery or Neman Bakery, right on the corner, and it's the street you cross right when you walk into the shuk. I guarantee you, those of us, there are many of us here who have gone through that intersection many, many, many times. It is the price that Klal Yisrael pays to have a homeland has always been steep. And the need to go ahead and on this Yom HaZikaron, take a few moments. And I want to tell you, if your children are not getting something in school about this, which it happens, schools have different hashkafas also, give them something at home. And remind them that today is the day that in Eretz Yisrael, Jews pause. In Eretz Yisrael, ein bayis asher ein shames. There's no family that doesn't go to a cemetery on Yom HaZikaron for someone. There's no such thing as a family who hasn't been touched by the sacrifice. And there's no such thing as a family who hasn't been touched by this tragedy. Every single family. And if you're lucky enough that it's not in your immediate family, then it's your neighbor, it's your friend. And also, if you think about it, imagine having a day where everyone, virtually everyone in the entire country, has a grave of someone who is somehow connected to them, who has fallen in the defense and in the establishment, and in just for living in Eretz Yisrael. It's an overwhelming thing. And it behooves us just to take a few moments, just to be able to reflect on the loss and to express our hakaras hatov, our gratitude for those shemasru nafsham, who literally have been willing to give their life. Again, people give their lives in different ways. There are soldiers who give their life in the act of securing the state of Israel. There are victims of terror who also die al Kiddush Hashem. For what crime? For the crime of creating a Jewish presence within Eretz Yisrael. So I saw yesterday, there was actually Meir Raskis sent me a link. There was a live stream to the Yom HaZikaron ceremony in the Knesset. And it was, I want to share with you two things that I saw that were absolutely overwhelming. They interviewed the mother of a soldier. The soldier's name was Bar Palach. So he was 30 years old. He died in an operation in Jenin. It's one of these special forces soldiers who died in an operation in Jenin. And they were interviewing the mother, interviewing the whole family. And she was talking about like the incredible outpouring of support. And they looked like a Chiloni type family, but the emunah that was coming out and the optimism that was coming out and commitment to Eretz Yisrael and to Am Yisrael that was coming out. And she was talking about how all of her son's friends from the army now became her extended family. And it was incredible. It was such a chizuk. And the way like her interview ended, she said this phrase, and I wrote it down right after she said it. She said, "Achshav yesh li yoter midai." She says, "I have like too much." She was talking about the beautiful family that she has, the outpouring of support. Aval ein li klum. Achshav yesh li yoter midai. I have so much. Aval ein li klum. But without my son, I have nothing. And I will say that phrase by itself, just that statement, was so powerful. Because it's not just a statement of a mother. It's a statement of a people. It's a statement of a people. We have everything. We have everything. We have everything as a people. Not everything. We need a basic Shnei Mashiach. But when you look at what we have relative to past generations, we have so much. But yet again, when we lose one neshama, ein li klum, we feel so bereft. We feel so empty. We feel like we're lacking so much. They then interviewed the widow of Noam Raz. So you remember again, Noam Raz was also one of these from the Yamam unit, like one of these one of these guys who just do like incredible things that no one ever knows about. So Noam Raz was killed on May 13th, 2022. And they were interviewing his widow, and she said the most incredible thing. She said, when is it that if you have perfume in a bottle, she said, when is it that you smell the perfume? She said, only once the bottle is smashed. When the bottle is smashed, then the fragrant aroma ultimately again comes out. And obviously the metaphor that she was giving was her husband was that bottle of perfume who no one ever knew about. And then he's killed. In order to safeguard Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, the flask is smashed. Some of the fragrant aroma of who he was, of what he did, and his mesiras nefesh for Klal Yisrael suddenly becomes known to all. And I will say, I thought that it was such a powerful metaphor for what Yom HaZikaron is. You know what Yom HaZikaron is? Yom HaZikaron is the day in which we remember that so many flasks have been smashed over the years. But with the smashing of the flask, one gets to really truly take in the fragrant aroma of who Klal Yisrael really is. Yom HaZikaron is the day of Areach Nicholach. Yom HaZikaron is the day when we get to go ahead and smell the incredible, pleasing aroma of Mesiras Nefesh, of what it means to be part of a klal, where young men, women, and children are willing to give of themselves for what? For what? For the sake of Am Yisrael, for the sake of Medinas Yisrael. And I will say, it's a very humbling and sobering feeling. Because the truth is, we 6,000 miles away, we have to figure out, where's our Mesiras Nefesh? Right? What are we willing to struggle for? What are we willing to sacrifice for? Where's our skin in the collective game of Am Yisrael? What are we contributing? What are we doing? Today we remember what so many have contributed. They pay the ultimate price with their lives. For what? For us. That Am Yisrael should have Eretz Yisrael in an uncontested fashion. The ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate price, so that we could have this incredible gift. Today is the day that the flask has been smashed, and we smell that incredible, overwhelming aroma of Mesiras Nefesh, of Kiddush Hashem. And I will say, as we ingest that aroma of Mesiras Nefesh, as we ingest that aroma of Kiddush Hashem, should inspire us to do great things for Klal Yisrael as well. Should inspire us to push ourselves a little bit more, to do a little bit more, to sacrifice a little bit more, to promote Avas Yisrael, Achdus. You know, a soldier doesn't get on the battlefield and say, you know what, I'm only protecting the Chilonim in my yishuv, or I'm only protecting the Charedim who live in my town. A soldier puts on his uniform, soldier picks up his rifle, soldier goes out to war, and who is he protecting? He's protecting every single Jew. You're religious, you're not religious. You want judicial reform, you don't want judicial reform. Doesn't make a difference. The soldier protects Am Yisrael. That's what it means to be a soldier of Am Yisrael. And even if we're not wearing the uniform and not carrying the weapon, each of us has the obligation to try to be a soldier of Am Yisrael as well. Figure out, what can we do for our people? What can we do for our Am? How can we somehow secure and make Am Yisrael just a little bit stronger, even in our own little way? And that's the chus. And that's the chus of internalizing the pleasing aroma of the sacrifices of so many. And there's a chus of taking in the aroma of the broken flask. May we zoche Amirat Hashem to give an aliyah to the neshamas of all of those who we remember today. And Amirat Hashem put Klal Yisrael just a little bit closer to the ultimate destination of Geula Mihira B'Yameinu. Amen.